webinar Implementing Nationally Determined Contributions. This is a webinar from the Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency from the CBIT platform. My name is Anna Cardoso, and I am the moderator for today's webinar, and I greet you all from Copenhagen. Before we go to the content of the webinar, I would like to inform about some housekeeping information. So the webinar is going to be about 1 hour, including time for questions and answers at the end. You can ask questions at any time. You can just simply use the panel you have that typically stands on the top right side of your screen. In case you cannot stay until the end, no worries, the materials and the recording of the webinar will be available online on the CBIT platform. And we have other webinars and information there. So you may want to check the events section of the CBIT platform to see what we already have there that may be interesting for you. I also would like to inform that we comply with the European Union's General Data Protection Act. And this means that your personal data, like your name, your email, your workplace, is safely processed and stored, and your rights pursuant to this law are respected. So you have full access to the data being processed about you, and you can request that data to be deleted or rectified. So if you want further information about this, please just enter in contact with the people that are presented in this slide. Today's webinar is about the implementation of NDCs, and I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Fatemeh Bakhtiari, that she will give a presentation about the process of implementing NDCs and the features that are useful to keep in mind regarding this process. This will be covering a recent publication that she will tell us about, where she was a contributor to that publication together with another colleague, Daniel Puig, who will also join us for the question and answer session. So I now invite Fatemeh to continue and to give us the presentation about implementing nationally determined contributions. I'll get back at the questions and answer session after the presentation.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone, and thanks for your interest and joining us for today's webinar. As Anna said, my name is Fatemeh Bakhtiari, and I'm a senior researcher at UNEP DTU Partnership, and it's my pleasure to present our recent publication on NDC implementation process on behalf of all other authors. So this publication is a joint effort of the UNEP Environment Program and UNDP in collaboration with UNFCCC, and with technical input from World Resource Institute and UNEP DTU Partnership. We also had different donors, and we are grateful for their support, such as GEF, GSP, Germany Ministry of Environment, Nuclear Conservation, NDC Partnership, and European Union, and other donors that are, because of time, I can't name them. Let us just talk about a bit of the rationale of this publication and why we came in agreement to have such a publication. So you know these 4 partners that I just mentioned, that they have a long experience of helping countries with putting together their NDCs at the beginning, starting in 2015, and helping countries with estimation and all the things related to NDCs, and then putting together the draft of NDCs. And now they decided to come together and write a publication together in order to have an agreed framework for countries that they are entering to the implementation phase. So the implementation of countries' nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, you all know that is inherently a country-driven and location-specific. But however, there are common features of the implementation that contribute to successful result of submission of a future NDCs. The aim of webinar today is for us to walk you all through choices in developing implementation strategies, which can be laid out in 5 generic steps that I'm going to talk about each step in detail. Let us talk about a bit of a background. You know that achieving the long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement requires that participating countries undergo transformation toward low-emission climate resilience development across all sectors. So while the INDC submitted to date represent an improvement in global emission pathway relative to what they had the beginning as a business as usual scenario, but the collective ambition they reflect, based on the estimation that we can see, is still far from consistent with the Paris Agreement long-term goal of limiting global warming, as you know, is 1 degree and 2 degrees. So what does it suggest? I just want to show you this figure just to make myself a bit more clear. The figure comes from Emission Gap Report. So you see in the line, vertical line, this is a gigaton CO2 equivalent, and then you can see in the horizontal line, these are the years starting from 2015. Countries started with their NDCs, and then now also up to 2030. And then you see we have the 2 lines. These are the ideal area that we want to be in 2030, which is 1 degree range and also the 2 degree. And then you see that the top line, no policy baseline, is the place that we will be in 2030 if we don't do anything. Country, they don't do anything. And then if they just do whatever they are doing related to current policy scenario, we will be at that range that you can see in the blue line. And then when we are looking at what they have promised and if they are successful to implement their current goals that they have in their NDCs, so you see the unconditional scenario and conditional NDC scenarios. And if you compare these unconditional scenarios with the very ideal place that we want to be with 1 degree, you see there is a still big gap of 32 gigaton CO2 equivalent. And it goes also with the conditional, which is a 29 gigaton CO2 equivalent. And if we say, okay, we forget about 1.5 degree, let us see what about the 2 degree, and still there is a gap of 15 gigaton and 30 for the conditional. So what does this suggest? This suggests that countries, it's very critical for countries to raise the NDC's ambition in order to achieve Paris Agreement goals. So the Paris Agreement tried to have some several approach in order to encourage countries to reach the goal and the Paris Agreement goal. So the agreement invites parties to develop long-term low-emission development strategies, which through them we could set a long-term objective to achieve zero net emission. And the long-term strategies are important because they can serve as a long-term vision, which they can enable countries to submit more ambitious NDCs in the future and also put countries on a path towards sustainable development. So Paris Agreement requests that parties prepare, communicate, and implement NDCs every 5 years. And these NDCs, they should reflect the short and medium-term measures that countries will undertake to reduce national emission and increase resilience. So in order to start putting together the development of implementation plan, we need to follow some steps. The first step that we put in that publication is alignment of NDC implementation with sustainable development goals. And this is relevant because now that countries have put forward their first NDCs, or I just want to be more clear that in 2020, countries, they have asked to put their first NDCs, to communicate their first NDCs, and then countries, they are embarking on implementation phase. So then how the NDCs are implemented and improved over time will determine whether the goals of the Paris Agreement as well as Sustainable Development Goals are achieved or not. So then it's very important, alignment of NDC implementation with Sustainable Development Goals is a very crucial for achieving and sustaining the level of economic and social transformation that is required by the goal of Paris Agreement. So it needs planning process and institutional arrangement for implementing the NDCs and translating the SDGs into national and sectoral plans that needs to be very well coordinated, also build on inclusive multi-stakeholder consultation, and should have very strong political buy-in. So to do that, countries can take a number of key steps for having that integrated and joint implementation of both NDCs and SDGs. So I'm going to talk step by step what are the steps and why they are important. So the first is to identify area of alignment and inconsistencies. So as it's clear from the title, it means to look through the NDC goals, SDGs, and find the trade-off and synergies, and basically to identify all this area of synergies and trade-off and be aware of that. The next step is to promote coordination across government. As I said in the previous slide, coordination is an important factor in that. So to make sure that those entities, they are responsible for NDC implementation, the coordinating an entity and participating entity, and all the people that they are involved in private sector in the implementation. So they should be well coordinated both for NDCs goals and also for the SDGs, and they should be aware of both concepts. Then we come to multi-stakeholder engagement opportunities. So it's very important whenever they have stakeholder consultation or the stakeholder engagement for NDCs, they should make sure that they also get their feedback related to SDGs. So they always should have the discussion of these two together to get the feedback needed. So while they get the input and feedback, identify the area of alignment, trade-off, and make sure about the coordination. Now it's the time that they are able to do the prioritization of these policies and actions. So to be able to prioritize the policies that best representative of the NDC goals and also the SDGs. So when they finish with the prioritization, another step is to pursue comprehensive and integrated finance strategies. So when countries, they are putting their national, they are setting their national budget and distributing national budget for climate related project related to NDCs, they should also be aware of aligning that and making the integrated finance strategies for SDGs related to NDCs as well. So both together. So they should avoid separate budgeting. And then last point, not least, and it's very important, related to also enhanced transparency phase that we are approaching, is establish mutually reinforcing monitoring and reporting framework. So by 2024, the Paris Agreement comes to full implementation phase, and countries, they have been asked to communicate about their NDC progress and also in this SDGs implementation. So it's very important from now on the countries think about to have a mutual monitoring and reporting framework, that whenever they are collecting data related to NDCs, they should also collect data related to SDGs and do that analysis together to be able to monitor and report both at the same time. After making sure about the alignment, then the second step is preparing for NDC implementation. So you know that each country will prepare for and implement its NDCs in different ways. For example, based on the nature of its NDCs, whether it's a target-based or focused primarily on policies and actions, how the NDCs was first developed. It was a bottom-up process or a top-down exercise, and depending on the national circumstance. So countries, they have different ways. But regardless of where countries are starting from, it is very beneficial to have an agreed whole of government approach that can be transparently communicated to all stakeholders. So there are some key steps involving for the preparation phase for NDC implementation, which I'm going to walk you through. So the first step, so before I go to the step, so that's the key point in here that I'm sure you all know. And engaging a stakeholder is very important to engage a stakeholder and get their input for all the steps. So that's why I have it at the side. So the first step is taking a stock of NDCs. And why is important? So to start with, for preparing for NDCs, we need to understand it. We need to understand what the NDC specifically commits, such as which greenhouse gases and sectors are included, and what target policies and action need to implement and report internationally. So taking a stock of the NDCs will enhance understanding of how the target goals and actions contained in NDC they have been chosen, and also it includes the extent to which they were already adopted and planned, or whether new measures need to be undertaken or not. So this all information you can reach when you do the exercise of stock taking for NDC. Then the second step is to confirm about the relevance of analysis. So it is helpful to confirm that underlying models and assumptions that have been used for development of NDCs still remains current and updated. And this is because given the time that has passed since the NDC were first developed, some of these underlying assumptions and analysis may have changed. So make sure about that. So what I mean by this is to look at the key analysis supporting on a mitigation component, for example, revisit, for example, greenhouse gas inventory data and emission projections, underlying cost assumptions and technology learning rates, implementation costs and enablers, and same goes with the adaptation component to look at the climate scenarios and vulnerability assessment, or using the low regret approach that most countries, or better say, some countries, when they put together the adaptation part in NDCs, they chose not to take uncertainties into account. So maybe it's a good time to look at reviewing the selection through the lens of low regret approach in order to take into account the uncertainties. And then also looking at the national adaptation plans, that there should be alignment between the goals, target, and priorities for adaptation communicated in the NDCs and national adaptation plan. So the other step is identify and prioritize policies and measures. So once potential policies and associated policy instruments have been identified, it is very helpful to undertake this prioritization exercise. So to analyze the trade-offs and benefits associated with the different policy options that you have, for example, including an analysis of alignment with sustainable development objectives, which can bring additional benefit beyond the future architecture of the NDCs. It can also inform stakeholders and secure their support by involving them, as I said, in this step more than other steps. This is very important to have their input. Then the other step is assessing the human and information capacities required for NDC implementation to make sure about sufficient number of staff members, which they have enough skills in different area or not, whether they have the quantitative data already available or not, or new data collection needed or not, so on and so forth related to this topic. Then the other step after that is to assess institutional framework for implementing the NDCs. So we are not aiming to invent a new wheel. As you know, all the focus is to look at the existing institutional framework, which all the countries, I would say, have when they put together their NDCs, to build on that, to review and strengthen the institutional framework that they have. And then identify or look at the role and responsibilities and see where they can strengthen that role and responsibilities. What is the role and responsibility of coordinating entity, and is it enough, or they need to make it more clear? What is the role and responsibility of the staff, or for example, creating how they can create adequate enabling condition for actions, or how through that institutional framework they can attract international financing support for implementation of the NDCs. And then also establish mechanism for public participation to facilitate dialogue among stakeholders and promote coordination. So these are all goes under the institutional framework. Make sure that we have the enough arrangement to enter the implementation phase. So after the institutional arrangement, or like the step after that are very much connected to each other, is to assess the existing regulatory framework and introduce needed framework based on the input we get from the existing institutional arrangement. For example, there are some countries that still there is no agreement or enough agreement or mandate to access data or sharing data among line ministries. So now the regulatory framework coming to the play and to ensure access to information and relevant data, or make sure about the legal status of entities expected to play different role for the implementation plan, and also to do to introduce some regulatory framework in order to strengthen coordination among key line ministries. So this is what we can do, getting benefit of having the regulatory framework in place. After the preparation of the NDC implementation, then the next step is to make sure about the financing NDC implementation. So financing of NDC implementation includes basically mobilizing new resources for climate actions, readjusting existing expenditure to avoid future costs, and delivering better on what has been already provided for needs. So this can also follow some steps to come with that development of the finance strategies. So the first is to have a mapping exercise to understand the governance of the climate finance in the country, to see how at the Ministry of Finance, national budget, allocate budget for the climate related project within each ministry, Ministry of Environment or other ministry, how that has been handled in order to get an understanding of the governance of that. The other step is to track public and private climate expenditure and investment. So by doing the mapping, then the countries can start making that tracking of, okay, this public expenditure and investment and private. So one example of that some countries they have already started doing it is the tagging system or tagging exercise that they start to put a tag on each finance related to climate project to make sure or to have an understanding of funding comes from the public or private. So all these things gives you an understanding, and you can use it for the next step, which is the costing NDCs. So costing NDC actions means assessing the scale of finance needed to realize NDC goals. So this will include financing of conditional and unconditional NDCs, as countries hope to be able to, as you know, to increase their ambition if future support is secured. So pursuing such analysis can help, as I said, mobilize international investment. If you have a system which can track the public and private expenditure and also the international support needed or international support received, so then it's easier for, or is more attractive for the external or international investment, external donor to come and invest on the NDCs. So to do the costing NDC action, there is no single methodologies, and several approaches can be used to construct a budget for a strategy or a programmatic intervention. So there are different methods that countries, based on their needs and their situation, type of information they have, they can use. Then for the step after is devising a smart financing strategies for priority intervention. So this basically refers to mobilizing new sources, but also about spending public resources in a smarter way and better align public and private capital with NDCs. So this can use the input from the other steps. So basically the point is integrated financing framework can feature comprehensive roadmap for aligning a country's climate policy to its budget, and provides the country's leadership with a better understanding of how to synchronize various NDC actions and investment objectives. So basically the purpose is to structure an effective delivery architecture for mobilizing and better managing of climate finance. So in this way, countries, they can have the comprehensive finance strategy for their NDCs. The other step after is an important step related to enhanced transparency framework is monitoring and reporting of NDC progress and achievement, to know basically what type of information should be collected to track the progress of NDC implementation and what elements should be included in monitoring plan. So monitoring and reporting progress during the NDC implementation period serves multiple purposes. For example, facilitates our understanding of progress made toward achieving the NDCs, and to know what additional progress is needed by the end of the NDC implementation period to inform for future action that we need to do, and also to identify and promote synergies between action taken to achieve the NDCs and action taken to achieve countries' SDGs. So therefore, enhanced transparency framework provides a foundation for monitoring and reporting related to NDC implementation. In the next slide, I'm just going to walk you through the improved reporting and transparency over time. So the ending is 2030, which in the NDCs or the NDCs countries, they had as the ending year for now, and then it will change. So as I said before, countries, they have been asked that to communicate by 2020 a new NDC. And every 5 years, they have to submit their new NDCs. And then we have also another reporting for Paris Agreement implementation is the global stocktake. Global stocktake it will take place in 2023, but the preparatory stage is in 2021, and is basically assessing collective progress toward achieving the Paris Agreement. The outcome of the stocktake will inform countries for updating and enhancing of parties' climate action and support. The stocktake, also like the NDCs, will happen every 5 years. Basically the input from global stocktake is input for countries to be able to submit their first BTR. The enhanced, so as I said, in 2024, that's the time that enhanced transparency framework will enter into the full implementation phase. And that's the time that they have to submit the first biennial transparency report, which that transparency report has different components. One of the components that which is related to our webinar today, they have to report on the NDC progress. And why this is important for us to know, it's because since they have to report on the NDC progress, we should already think about having, or countries should think about having the indicators already in their NDCs in order for the biennial transparency report to use that indicator and report on the NDC progress. So, and this is just to show you every 5 years we have the NDCs and global support program. Then, to do that monitoring and reporting of NDC progress, we need to take care of some steps. The first is to make sure about the NDC's target what are the NDC target that we want to monitor. One example is still when we are looking at the draft of some countries' NDCs, we see that they do not still have a clear target to be monitored. The target should be very clear in order to be monitored and then assess the NDC progress. So then countries should make sure about the targets. And also the indicator to be tracked over time should be defined, and all the baseline related to that and source of the data. Then making sure about the institutional roles, entity or institution responsible for collecting and compiling data, or the role and responsibility of the staff that involved in monitoring. So basically making sure when we are going to have this monitoring and reporting in place, making sure about the institutional arrangement for that. And then the countries, they should think about how frequent they want to monitor to ensure about the timelines and consistent time series of information. Also, they need to think about which measures they want to use, what method, what software tools for data management, for example, they want to use in order to monitor and report. So one thing that is very important in this monitoring and reporting system is also country needs to think about the information system, centralized information system for NDC progress that they need to have. In previous some webinar, I'm sure in the NDC platform we have those publication and webinar that you can go and have a look to see what are the process needed for establishing such centralized information system. So I'm not talking about that. We mentioned it also in the publication you can read through. Then countries need to think about the quality assurance and quality control process that they want to have, verification process, and also internal auditing. So we talked about countries need to think about the indicator that they use to be able to also, for the BTR, they use and report on those indicators. So countries need to select those indicators, and to be able to report on the progress of that indicator, they need to to compare basically the reference information on the indicator with the most relevant or the recent information on the indicators. So indicators can be different based on the country's NDCs target. They all vary. Not like, for example, net GIG emission and removal, percentage reduction of the GIG intensity, relevant qualitative indicators for specific policies. Mitigation co-benefit can be an indicator, or co-benefits of adaptation actions, and for example, economic diversification plans, or also non-GIG indicator and quantitative indicator like hectares of reforestation. So after setting up that, making sure about the monitoring and reporting of the NDC progress, now is the time to think about revising strategies and preparing for subsequent NDCs. And why we say that? So we get the input from the monitoring and reporting about the progress. So by that, it reveals that we need to change something if we realize that the NDCs actions, they are not basically achieving the goals that they should. So a formal review mechanism that includes public participation and engagement across government and elected bodies can allow countries to assess the extent to which changes in the NDC implementation plan and require the pros and cons of various ways to revise it. So engaging the public at this stage is important because it helps to prioritize measures and strengthen support for the revised implementation plan. So as I said, if monitoring result reveals that actions are performing well, the country can strengthen those actions. If it reveals that current measures will not achieve the NDCs, the country can adjust its strategies or pursue additional measures. But this is also very important to know that once an implementation strategy is revised, it should communicate transparency to the public. And also it's important to know, I'm sure you all know, that it can only be adjusted to be more ambitious. And after revising the strategy is finished, it will also need to be communicated with UNFCCC. So revising the strategies, for example, for mitigation and adaptation, how are they? So countries can pursue a mitigation assessment to inform the adjustment of the strategies and assessment of additional measures following some steps. So for example, the first step is to develop an informational baseline scenarios that represent the growth in emissions most likely to occur in absence of additional mitigation initiative. Because they are thinking about to add, for example, some additional actions. So now first they have to make sure about the baseline without those actions. And then identify and characterize mitigation options, for example, including its policy, is it policy and action or technology based on factors such as mitigation potential, cost, and co-benefit. Then developing alternative scenarios that represent emission trajectory that would occur if the mitigation strategies were implemented, to see where they will be with those extra mitigation actions that are going to introduce, and then estimate incremental costs and benefits, including co-benefits and social cost and benefit of the mitigation strategies. So the same goes with the adaptation assessment. Like the first step is identify action and measures which are not included in the initial NDCs and opportunities to leverage synergies with SDGs and new national development priorities. And then build on existing adaptation actions and priorities to initiate a comprehensive national adaptation plan or other adaptation planning process. And then monitor and review implementation of the national adaptation planned during the first monitoring cycle of the NDCs or the iterative national adaptation timeline in order to identify emerging priorities and also to account of progress made to modify those priorities and also address additional action identified through the monitoring cycle. And then last but not least, also taking care of gender analysis, which is lacking in most of the drafts that we have seen. So to conduct the gender analysis in key sectors based on qualitative and quantitative data, so that can make some additional improvement for adaptation strategies in order to achieve the goal that countries are expected to. So doing this two assessment of mitigation and adaptation, the countries, they will be able to revise their NDC strategies and also go forward for the new NDCs. So that was what I had using the publication that we have, and you can read more and more in detail for that publication at which already is at the CBIT platform library, and you can always reach out to us, write to me or Anna if you need some clarification about some of the chapters or any point, so we can put you in touch with the co-author related to each chapter, and yeah, we take it from there. So thank you very much for your attention. So I'm going to give the floor now to Anna to start the question and answer session.
Okay, so thank you so much, Fatemeh. It was a really interesting and very complete presentation. I think we had a lot of people listening very attentively because we received a lot of questions and also some comments. So I would like to say again that the recording of the webinar and the slides will be uploaded to the CBIT platform. Please check the events section of the CBIT platform where you will find this information. And I also would like to say a word that we stand with our colleagues in Argentina and in all the other places that are struggling with this health crisis of the COVID, and still with so many problems now happening everywhere in the world, but especially in the south now. I think it's really impressive to have some of you attending this webinar and still working and trying to become more informed about the implementation of nationally determined contributions. And now to the questions. So we have this question about how to undertake the prioritization of actions, as the NDCs have to cover all sectors. So Fatemeh or Daniel, which is now online with us, please, would you mind saying something about this?
Right. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Daniel, and thanks Fatemeh and Anna for this very comprehensive presentation, and Anna for the introduction. Yeah, on how to undertake prioritization, that's a political decision, obviously, and it depends on several factors, not least of all the funds that you have available. One tool that we've used in different contexts and that I would recommend as a short answer to the question is multi-criteria decision analysis, which allows you to take into account not just the financial side of things, the monetary side of things, which is what you can do very well with cost-benefit analysis, but it also allows you to take into account other non-financial measures. And in fact, one of the criteria in that multi-criteria decision analysis could be the result of a cost-benefit analysis. How do you do it? My short answer would be MCDA, multi-criteria decision analysis is a good way to start.
Thank you so much, Daniel. So this political aspect is important to keep in mind. Another question still related with this prioritization asks if there are any specific criteria for prioritization. So given that it's a country driven, so it's built on countries' needs and capacities. The clarification, I guess Daniel already answered this, but Fatemeh, if you want to say something more.
Yes, exactly. Daniel already said that what has to be mentioned about this or being taken care of. Well, I just want to remind you again about this specific criteria for prioritization should cover both not only the GIG related goals and also adaptation goals, but also SDGs. So to make sure that your criteria covering all these aspects when you are going to look at some policies. So I have an example about that. So we were working with, I'm not saying the name of a country, but when they revisited their NDCs goal related to, for example, transport sector that they had at the time, when they wanted to prioritize the policies, they were just looking at the mitigation aspect of it. But when they revisited and started to set up the criteria for prioritization, that which policy they need to have, they also included the sustainable development benefits in that. And then they were able to prioritize some other policies that they didn't taken care of at the beginning. So making sure about the criteria that it is a country-driven approach, but at the time also you have some certain facts that you need to follow. As I said, for example, aligning with SDGs when you are reporting to the for the BTR.
Thank you, Fatemeh. Thank you also for that example. So moving forward to another question, now about institutional arrangements. The question basically says it's not clear how an entity would play a different role in NDC implementation. Could you give some example? Fatemeh, would you like to start, or maybe Daniel?
So I'm not a bit clear. You mean one entity can play different roles in implementation, or how the distribution of the role and responsibility can be done? Because for the NDC implementation, as I mentioned, so for the establishment of the institutional arrangement, we need to make sure that one entity should be the coordinating entity. And that coordinating entity that needs to make sure about the collaboration of other entities and how they will connect to each other. For example, when they want to, who is going to report the data on what, and how they want to analysis in which entity, and how they want to make sure about the quality assurance and quality control. So that's basically the distribution of the roles and responsibilities. Daniel, if you have more input, maybe you can add.
No, nothing from my side. I mean, I would have said what you just said. I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think what you summarized is what hopefully is behind the question, which is you need a structure, you need some kind of decision-making structure, and that's maybe step number one in a sense, because otherwise the whole thing becomes unmanageable, whether it's data management systems or prioritizing, as was referred to in the previous question. So I hope that we are answering this person by saying that this is building this what should I say, accountability nearly mechanisms would be perhaps one of the first steps.
Thank you, Fatemeh and Daniel. Well, I do hope that we also managed to answer, but if not, I'll just invite the person who asked this question to clarify or to ask another question that we could answer. If not during this session, we will answer in written and publish together with the slides. Then comes a question about the finance part. If you could explain what a smarter way of spending public resources could be. So I guess it's a interesting question. Fatemeh or Daniel?
I would say this is also a political decision. It's like all the countries, they have their own priorities, and they are the one that needs to sit down and see what is the smart way of spending that public resource should be allocated to this project, that project, or if they are allocating it to this project, in which way, and also at the same time how they can invest it in order to, sometimes they can also, by that investment, they can encourage private sectors, and private sector come into play and invest. So that's basically leveraging the engagement of private sector, and it's in a way like a smart way of spending that public resources. This is what I have in my mind. If you have anything to add, Daniel, that would be great. Otherwise, I think this is purely political decision.
No, I agree, and I would extend private sector to donors as well in the case of developing countries. I think because domestic resources tend to be scarce or very scarce, I think the word or the phrase "smart way of spending public resources," I would interpret it as acting as catalyzers for money that comes from the private sector or from donors. So basically in line with what Fatemeh said, except that adding maybe donors in there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think a good follow-up question to this is we have someone who asks, how can the private sector be integrated into the implementation of NDCs? So could you say a bit about that, just I guess it fits really well with this part now.
That's actually a very good question, and I would say when we are entering to that transparency implementation of the Paris Agreement, the enhanced transparency framework time, so it's important to countries to communicate the data not only coming from the public sector but also from the private sectors. And again, the example is that the country that I was working with, so at the beginning, for some sector, like for example, forestry sector, or the same with the transport sector, they didn't have any data coming from the private sector. So basically, in a way, private sectors, they were involved in at some point in implementation, but not officially. They didn't get invitation to when they were putting the NDC together, or even NDC draft. So they did not get invitation to that. And you know, nowadays it's very important, as I said, for countries to raise the ambition of their NDCs. Or I would say another way is, so when we see that the countries, they are not able to reach the goal of the Paris Agreement, maybe it's because countries, they are not taking the participation of private sector into account. So they are not aware of the mitigation action that private sector they are doing, because they don't have transparent data from them. So by having them, involving them in the implementation plan, we make sure about that aspect. And then also we make sure about if they are interested to participate in the implementation of the mitigation actions or the adaptation actions. That's also another way of engaging them. Or another way is, I would say, is this private sector, they can be like an entity, they are able to collaborate with public sectors, and they make sure that, okay, where we are with this implementation of the NDCs from the public sector, and they can even come to the play and somehow give some suggestions for the implementation. So I think that's the way you can involve the private sectors for the implementation plan.
Okay, so moving on, we still have a couple minutes. We can take a few more questions. So this one is, if you could give some examples of qualitative indicators for policies and measures. Maybe there are already some in the publication, right, Fatemeh?
Yeah, it's again, because this is a qualitative indicator. So qualitative indicator, you have different options. It's like based on basically how you want to report on that. Is it like a strongly relevant, not relevant, or the progress is how you can categorize it qualitatively, or even do the ranking. Ranking is another way, or the indicator to make sure about that. Or like, for example, I remember for some of the indicator related to adaptation, that providing the clear air. So it's like a low, medium, and high. So these are the range of the qualitative indicators. There's no really a fixed approach for that, because it's a qualitative. So you decide about that, as long as it's informative enough that you are able to track a progress.
Yeah, so we go now to the part on monitoring and monitoring the implementation. What would be your recommendations regarding institutional arrangements for monitoring the implementation? Fatemeh or Daniel?
I think we already touched upon this institutional arrangement, but what I say is to start from reviewing the existing institutional arrangement that we have in the country. That's what we start when we are working with different countries. So to see where we are and what are the roles that we already have in place. For example, in some of the cases or the countries, the recent country that I worked, Ministry of Environment and Energy was the coordinating entity. Started with the NDCs, and it wanted to remain the coordinating entity for the implementation. And then it needs to have like a core group within that ministry, and they call it, for example, NDC unit, and they are the ones responsible to get the data from other sectors. And it's important to also involve other sectors and have a unit in each sector in order to collect the data. And those units in each sector that are collecting data, they report to a centralized data system, which is under the control of this NDC unit, for example. And make sure about the quality. And this NDC unit, which is expert from different sectors, they are making sure about the quality of the informations and to harmonize it. And that's the responsibility of that NDC unit, to basically provide the templates in order to harmonize the way that the sector, they have to report the data. Because if there is no like a comprehensive or harmonized way of data collection, so different sectors provide data in different format, and then it's a mess. So they can't really, that unit cannot analyze them in a very efficient way. So these are the different recommendations that countries need to make sure about that. We have one publication about this institutional arrangement that you can find, and there are some guides about the institutional arrangement for monitoring of the NDCs available. So Daniel, would you like to add any, because this is also your area?
Yeah, well, at the risk of stating the obvious, just a couple of clarifications. There is much more practice with mitigation than with adaptation, and so institutional arrangements are better established. So when one thing that has worked well, I'm going to be cautious like Fatemeh, I'm going to follow your example. I'm not going to name countries, but what seems to be working well is, like I said, to state the obvious maybe, that there is very high level, top level endorsement of those arrangements that you set in place for, in this case, monitoring, but it could be for any other thing related to NDC implementation. That's what we've seen, that the things tend to work when work comes from upstairs, as it were. And I think in this case, it is very, very clear. And like I said, because for adaptation, there is less experience and less mechanisms in place, that's even more effective when you can have it that way, of course, which is not always.
Thank you very much, both of you. We have a comment that I think is good to finalize it. Finalize this webinar. would you mind commenting on this COVID-19 crisis hampering NDC commitments and slowing down the process? Would you like to comment on that, and what can possibly countries do in relation to that, if you have any idea?
Yeah, there was a previous question about resources. What can you do in light of limited resources and such? I didn't say anything in the interest of time, but I'll use the argument that works well with that and with COVID. Long-term strategies obviously were not introduced because of any health pandemic, but I think and again with limited resources, the comment is equally valid. I think it's helpful to, or long-term strategies are helpful because they allow you to say, all right, if I take a longer view on things, this is what my country wants to do. And then there's going to be ups and downs, and here we have a down with COVID. In limited resources will be a different type of downturn, if you will. So I think it's good to look at it from that perspective. I will have bumps on the road, but where do I want to go in the long term? That would be my take on this.
I'm not sure if Fatemeh, would you like to say something, or we?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think it was comprehensive.
So I thank you all for attending the webinar, and I thank you especially Fatemeh and Daniel for presenting this publication, which you can download from the library of the CIVIT platform. You can also Google it and find it online in other places. And yes, I wish you a very good day for all of you. And please check the event section of CIVIT platform, where the slides and the recording and the questions that we didn't manage to answer will be published. Thank you very much.